I'm Elise, I'm 32, and for 4 years while I was building a stable, ordinary life 2 hours away, my parents told our entire extended family that I had disappeared. Not that we were estranged, not that I'd gone no contact. Disappeared, the way that word implies something frightening and unresolved, the kind of word that gets relatives organizing search efforts and quietly slipping my mother cash to help find her. I found out about all of it the same week I got served with a lawsuit for a credit account I'd never opened, in collections for a debt I didn't know existed. I want to tell you what happened once I finally understood the full shape of what my parents had actually built during those 4 years of silence. It involves credit applications filed in my name, using information they were never supposed to still have. A forged signature, a handwriting examiner confirmed wasn't mine. A brother who unknowingly handed them exactly what they needed to keep finding me, and a story about my own disappearance that turned out to be entirely deliberately fictional. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the family members labeled as the problem usually turn out to be the ones who finally stopped being useful. If you've ever gone quiet to protect yourself and found out later what story got told about your silence, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. I grew up the oldest of 3, in a household where money was tight often enough that I understood, from a fairly young age, that I was expected to help once I was old enough to earn any. I didn't resent that expectation exactly, not at first. I got my first steady job at 22, and within a few months, sending a portion of every paycheck home to my parents simply became part of my monthly routine, the same automatic transfer as my rent or my car payment. My mother called it helping the family stay afloat. I believed her for a long time, without ever asking to see exactly what afloat actually meant in practical terms. I sent money home consistently for almost 6 years, through raises and job changes, and one particularly lean stretch of my own that I never once mentioned to my parents, because admitting I was struggling too felt somehow like it would have been letting them down. My younger siblings, Caleb and Marisol, grew up watching that arrangement as simply how our family worked. The oldest sends money, the parents manage it, everyone else benefits. I didn't think much about how uneven that structure actually was, until the year everything finally came apart. I remember, distinctly, the first time I actually questioned it out loud, sometime in my mid-20s, mentioning offhand to my mother that I'd had to skip a friend's destination wedding because the flight cost would have eaten into that month's transfer. She'd laughed, a little too brightly, and said, "Family comes first, sweetheart. You know that," in the specific tone she used whenever she wanted a conversation to end, rather than continue. I remember feeling in that moment a small flicker of something like resentment, quickly smoothed over by the deeper, more familiar feeling of wanting to be the reliable one. The daughter who never made things harder than they already were. The unraveling started with an ordinary piece of mail, a collections notice, addressed to me at my own apartment, for a credit card account I had absolutely no memory of ever opening. I called the number on the letter, assuming some kind of clerical error, and spent nearly 40 minutes on hold before a representative confirmed the account details. Opened 6 years earlier, at an address I recognized instantly as my parents' house, delinquent for months, now in collections for just over $4,000. I remember standing in my kitchen the entire 40 minutes, phone pressed to my ear, absently reorganizing the same 3 items in my junk drawer over and over, needing something to do with my hands while the hold music looped for the 6th or 7th time. When the representative finally read back the account's opening date, I did the quick mental math without meaning to, and realized it fell during a period I remembered clearly. The same year I'd taken on extra freelance work specifically to help cover an unexpected car repair for my mother. Work I'd mentioned to her at the time, work she'd thanked me for extensively. I hadn't understood, hanging up that call, that gratitude and deception had apparently been happening in the very same conversations. I called my mother that same evening, more confused than angry at first, genuinely believing there had to be some explanation that would make sense of an account I'd apparently opened without remembering it. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment before admitting, carefully, that she and my father had opened it using my information years earlier, just to help bridge a rough patch, fully intending, she said, to pay it off themselves before I ever needed to know about it. I asked her how they'd had enough of my information to open a credit account in the first place. She didn't have a good answer for that question. Neither, it turned out, did my father, when I finally got him on the phone, separately later that same week. My mother's voice on that first call kept circling back to reassurance rather than explanation, the same handful of phrases, repeated in slightly different order. "We were always going to tell you eventually. It wasn't supposed to become a big deal. You know we'd never actually let it hurt you." I remember sitting very still on my couch, letting her talk, waiting for something that actually resembled an answer to my original question, rather than another attempt to manage how I was feeling about the answer she didn't have. By the end of that call, I understood I wasn't going to get a real explanation that night. I just didn't yet understand how much further the actual explanation, once I finally found it years later, was going to reach. Digging further over the following days, mostly out of a growing disbelieving need to understand the full scope of what had happened, I learned the $4,000 hadn't gone toward household bills or my siblings' needs at all. It had gone in large part toward my father's gambling debts, a habit I hadn't even known he had until that exact conversation, one he'd apparently been managing quietly for years, increasingly propped up by money that was never supposed to exist in the first place. I remember the specific disorienting quality of learning something that large about a parent I thought I knew well, the way it forced me to instantly re-examine years of small memories for evidence I'd apparently missed, the occasional unexplained absence on weekend evenings, a period a few years back when he'd suddenly picked up extra shifts at work that never seemed to translate into extra visible income, a tension between my parents that I'd always chalked up to ordinary marital friction rather than anything more specific. None of it had ever added up to a clear picture on its own. Laid end to end against this new information, it all suddenly reorganized itself into something considerably harder to look away from. I confronted both of my parents together, sitting in their living room on an ordinary Sunday afternoon that ended up being the last ordinary anything between us for a very long time. I told them as plainly as I could manage through my own shock and hurt that I couldn't continue sending money home under those circumstances, and that I needed real, honest answers about how deep this actually went before I could trust either of them with anything financial again. My mother cried. My father got defensive, insisting the account had always been temporary, that they'd have paid it off eventually, that I was overreacting to what amounted to a family being a family. I left that afternoon and stopped sending money the following month. The first time in 6 years, my paycheck hadn't automatically split itself between my own life and Mare's. I remember driving home from that confrontation with my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary, replaying my father's exact words. "You're overreacting to what amounts to a family being a family," turning the sentence over and over, testing whether it might actually be true if I looked at it from enough different angles. It never quite settled into something I could accept, no matter how many times I turned it. Somewhere around the halfway point of that drive, I remember deciding with a clarity that surprised me given how raw everything else felt, that whatever else this turned into, I wasn't going to let that particular sentence be the last word on what had actually just happened between us. I want to be honest about what the months right after that decision actually felt like, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came later. I wasn't angry in a loud, dramatic way. I was mostly exhausted and quietly, persistently sad, grieving a version of my family I'd apparently never fully had, while also trying to rebuild my own finances and sense of stability from something close to scratch. I went low contact with my parents that same year, not a dramatic announced cutoff, just a slow, deliberate stepping back. Fewer calls, shorter visits, eventually no visits at all. I told myself at the time that I was simply protecting my own peace. I didn't yet understand what story my absence was quietly being turned into on the other side of that silence. I built a genuinely good life during those 4 years. Work I found meaningful, a small, tight circle of friends who became something close to chosen family. A relationship with my partner Owen that felt, for the first time in my adult life, entirely uncomplicated by financial obligation or guilt. I still sent Caleb and Marisol occasional messages, careful ones, mostly avoiding any real discussion of our parents, and I assumed, without much evidence either way, that our extended family simply understood I drifted apart from my parents the ordinary, unremarkable way adult children sometimes do. I had no idea for 4 straight years that drifted apart wasn't remotely the story being told about me at every family gathering I wasn't present for. Owen used to ask me, in the early years of our relationship, whether I ever wanted to reconnect with my parents in some limited way, careful never to push, just checking in periodically the way a genuinely supportive partner does. I usually told him I wasn't ready yet, that I needed more distance before I could even consider what a limited relationship might look like. Looking back, I understand now that some part of me was also protecting myself from a truth I hadn't yet discovered. That there wasn't actually a version of limited reconnection available to me during those years that didn't also mean stepping back into a story about myself I didn't yet know existed, one I would have had absolutely no way to correct from the outside. The lawsuit summons arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, 4 years almost to the month after that living room confrontation. A different account this time opened, according to the paperwork, roughly 18 months into my period of low contact, for an amount considerably larger than the first one, now escalated all the way to formal litigation. Kitchen table with that summons in my hands, feeling something cold and disbelieving settle over me. This wasn't an old mistake finally catching up. Someone had opened a new account in my name well after I'd already discovered and confronted the first one. I called Owen at work, something I almost never did during his shift hours, and he left early the moment he heard the specific unsteadiness in my voice, arriving home to find me still sitting exactly where I'd been when I first opened the envelope. The summons spread flat on the table in front of me, like it might make more sense if I stared at it long enough. He didn't say much at first, just sat down across from me and read through the paperwork himself, slowly, before finally saying, "This isn't your mess to clean up quietly, Elise. Whatever this is, it needs actual lawyers, not just another difficult phone call with your parents." I think that sentence, more than anything else that whole day, was the thing that finally moved me from shocked paralysis into action. I called a consumer rights attorney the next morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Delphine Coro who specialized in identity theft and fraudulent debt cases. She reviewed the lawsuit paperwork along with the details of the earlier account and told me plainly, this pattern, on multiple accounts, spread across years, using information the account opener would only have if they had ongoing access to your personal details. This isn't a one-time family mistake anymore. This is a sustained pattern that needs to be treated as identity theft, formally through the proper legal channels. Delphine helped me pull my full credit history that same week, and what came back showed considerably more than the 2 accounts I already knew about. A total of 4 fraudulent credit lines had been opened in my name over the preceding 6 years, 3 of them predating my confrontation with my parents, 1 opened well after I'd gone low contact, all of them tracing back to addresses associated with my parents' household at the time each account was opened. Delphine walked me through the full credit report line by line, each fraudulent account highlighted in a different color, and I remember sitting in her office watching the pattern take shape on the page in front of me, feeling less like I was reviewing my own financial history, and more like I was watching a stranger's carefully documented crime unfold in real time. The spacing here is what stands out to me, Delphine said, pointing to the gaps between each account's opening date. Whoever did this wasn't panicking and grabbing whatever they could all at once. This was patient, spread out enough to avoid drawing attention, repeated enough to keep working as a resource whenever it was needed again. I asked her how often she saw patterns this deliberate in her line of work. She said, more often than she wished she did. I sat with that number a long time, 4 separate accounts, understanding, with a growing sick clarity, that the first conversation in their living room hadn't actually been the full truth even then. Whatever my mother had described as just to help bridge a rough patch had apparently been one instance in an ongoing pattern stretching back further than either of them had ever admitted to me directly. Around that same time, preparing reluctantly for my cousin Priya's upcoming wedding, An event I could no longer avoid, given how central she'd been in my life growing up. I received a text from my Aunt Denise that stopped me completely. "So glad you're finally back in touch, sweetheart. We've all been so worried these past few years. Your mom kept saying she had no idea where you'd gone. I'm just relieved you're safe." I read that message 3 times before the full weight of it landed. Worried these past few years? No idea where you'd gone. My aunt wasn't describing an estrangement she understood. She was describing something else entirely, something considerably more alarming, that had apparently been the accepted story in my extended family for a very long time. I read that text sitting in my car outside the grocery store, engine still running, groceries forgotten in the passenger seat for nearly 10 minutes, while I tried to make the words rearrange themselves into something less alarming than what they plainly said. I typed out 3 different replies before deleting all of them, unsure how to respond to a level of concern I didn't yet fully understand the shape of. I finally settled on a simple, "Can we talk on the phone? I want to make sure I understand what you mean," and sent it before I could second-guess it any further, my hands not quite steady on the wheel by the time I finally pulled out of the parking lot. I called Denise directly, careful and genuinely confused, asking her to explain exactly what she meant. What she told me over the following 20 minutes rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 4 years. My parents, according to Denise, had been telling the extended family since almost the beginning of my low-contact period that I had disappeared, vague enough to avoid an outright lie, specific enough to imply something frightening, something that had prompted genuine, sustained concern, informal outreach to old friends of mine, even, Denise admitted, a modest collection some relatives had quietly put together at one point, to help with finding you, in case you needed anything once you turned up. Denise described the collection specifically. Once I pressed her for details, nearly $600, gathered quietly among a handful of cousins and aunts over the course of about a year, held by my mother, just in case, she'd told everyone, in case Elise turns up somewhere needing a plane ticket home or a place to stay. I sat with that number a long time after we hung up, understanding that $600 was a small amount compared to the fraudulent accounts, but somehow it was the detail that hurt the most to hear described plainly, not abstract fraud through a faceless bank this time, but actual people who loved me, quietly setting aside money out of genuine fear for my safety, money my mother had apparently been perfectly willing to accept and hold on to indefinitely. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call for a long time, phone still warm in my hand, trying to absorb the sheer scope of what my parents had apparently constructed. They hadn't simply avoided explaining an estrangement to people who might have judged them for it. They'd built an entire sustained fiction, one detailed and consistent enough to generate real concern, real effort, apparently even real money from relatives who believed they were helping search for a missing woman who, in reality, had a job, an apartment, a partner, and a phone number that hadn't changed once in 4 years. I understood, sitting there, exactly why that particular fiction had been useful to them beyond simply avoiding embarrassment. A daughter who'd cut off contact over financial exploitation was a story that made my parents look bad. A daughter who'd mysteriously disappeared was a story that made them look like victims, sympathetic, deserving of exactly the kind of support, financial and otherwise, that a suddenly missing child's parents might reasonably receive. I thought about the fraudulent account opened 18 months into that supposed disappearance and understood with a clarity that made my stomach turn that the fiction and the fraud had likely been operating on parallel tracks the entire time, each one serving a different but related to purpose. I brought all of this to Delphine, who listened without much visible surprise, the specific calm of someone who'd heard variations of this pattern before in her line of work. Financial exploitation and reputation management often travel together in cases like this, she said. The fabricated narrative isn't incidental to the fraud, it's protective cover for it, and sometimes, like it sounds like here, it's also its own separate source of sympathy and resources. She recommended I formally file identity theft reports with both the FTC and local police for all 4 fraudulent accounts, understanding that doing so would create an official record entirely separate from, and considerably harder to dispute than, whatever story my parents had been telling everyone informally for years. I filed those reports the following week, providing Delphine with every piece of supporting documentation I could gather. Old pay stubs proving my actual whereabouts and employment during the periods each account was opened, my own apartment lease going back the full 4 years, phone records showing consistent, unbroken activity the entire time I was supposedly missing. For the first time since the lawsuit summons arrived, I understood I wasn't just defending myself against a single fraudulent debt anymore. I was formally permanently documenting the plain, boring truth of my own continuous, ordinary existence against a story specifically designed to suggest otherwise. Delphine laid out my options once the formal reports were filed. I could pursue the fraud dispute entirely through legal channels, keeping my extended family out of it, letting the lawsuit and the credit bureau disputes resolve quietly without ever directly confronting the disappeared narrative in front of relatives who believed it. I could send a single factual message to the extended family group chat correcting the record plainly without confrontation, and let people draw their own conclusions. Or I could wait until Priya's wedding, where most of the relevant relatives would already be gathered, and have the harder, more direct conversations in person, on my own terms, rather than through a screen. I thought about my aunt's text, the genuine relief in it, the quiet collection some relatives had apparently put together, believing they were helping search for me. I understood, sitting with Delphine's options in front of me, that the legal case alone wouldn't undo the years those relatives had spent genuinely worried about a version of my life that never actually existed. Untangling Matt required something more than a credit bureau dispute letter. I chose to do both, pursue the fraud case fully through Delphine's office, while also preparing to have real, honest conversations at the wedding, understanding that neither path alone would fully address what my parents had actually built. Delphine's investigator, digging further into the most recent fraudulent account, found something that reframed the entire pattern one more time. A handwriting examiner she brought in to review the account's authorization signature confirmed, definitively, that the signature didn't match any of my verified samples, not simply similar, but structurally inconsistent in ways that ruled out even a rushed or careless version of my own handwriting. The forged signature moved the case decisively out of any gray area my parents might have hoped to argue their way through as poor judgment or family financial enmeshment. This was, plainly, forgery on a formal financial document, and Delphine confirmed it strengthened both the fraud dispute and my standing to pursue whatever legal consequences I eventually decided were appropriate. A different detail, buried in the most recent account's opening paperwork, caught my attention. Independently, the application date fell just 2 weeks after a brief holiday visit I'd made to see Caleb the previous year, a short, careful reconnection I'd kept deliberately separate from any contact with our parents. I sat with that timing a long moment, a new uncomfortable question forming. Had Caleb, without realizing it, given our parents something they'd used to open that account? I called Caleb directly, gently, needing to understand without accusing him of anything before I had real answers. He was quiet for a long moment once I explained the timing, then admitted, his voice tightening, that he'd mentioned to our mother, during a completely ordinary conversation, that I'd moved to a new apartment, and had, without thinking twice about it, shared the general area since she'd asked, so she could maybe send a card. He hadn't given her my exact address. He had, unknowingly, given her enough to help narrow down information she apparently used, through other means, to complete that final account's paperwork. Caleb's reaction, once the full weight of what he'd unknowingly enabled actually landed, was one of the rawest conversations of that entire ordeal. "She told me she just wanted to send you a birthday card," he said, voice breaking. "I believed her, Ulysses. I've believed nearly everything she's told me for years, including that you'd disappeared, including that we should all be worried sick. I don't know how to sit with the fact that I might have helped her keep tracking you down while telling everyone else she had no idea where you'd gone." I told him, as gently as I could manage, that he hadn't done anything wrong by sharing an ordinary detail with his own mother, and that the manipulation belonged entirely to the person who'd used it, not to the sibling who trusted her the way any child reasonably trusts a parent. Caleb was quiet for a long moment after I said that, and when he spoke again, his voice had steadied slightly, though I could still hear how shaken he was underneath it. I keep thinking about all the times I told people, family friends, my own coworkers even, that we didn't know where you were, he said. I said it with real worry in my voice, Elise, because I actually believed it. I don't know how to process the idea that I was worried about something that was never true, while also somehow helping keep the actual truth from everyone at the same time. I told him that neither of those things made him complicit in what our parents had done. It just meant he'd been given the same false information everyone else had, delivered by someone he had every reason to trust completely. I arranged a call with both of my parents together, with Delphine's guidance on what to disclose and what to hold back for the formal legal process, needing to hear, if I could get it, some direct accounting from them before the wedding forced everything into a more public setting. My mother's explanation when it finally came was the closest thing to a full picture I ever received. I told people you disappeared because I couldn't bring myself to say you'd left because of us, she said. It felt like less of an admission somehow, and once people started worrying, started asking how they could help, I told myself keeping the story going a little longer wouldn't really hurt anyone, that it was just easier than constantly explaining the truth. I asked her directly whether she'd ever once considered what it would feel like for me to eventually learn what story had been told in my absence, whether any part of her had worried about the moment it might all come apart. She was quiet for a long time before answering, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. I think I told myself I'd fix it before that ever happened. I think I told myself that about a lot of things these past 4 years, and none of them ever actually got fixed. They just got easier to keep not fixing the longer I put it off. It wasn't a satisfying answer. It was, at least, more honest than anything she'd offered me on that very first phone call about the collections notice, 4 years and a lawsuit earlier. My father, when I pressed him about the most recent account specifically, offered considerably less. We were going to pay it back, he said, the same phrase from 4 years earlier, apparently the only explanation he had ready, regardless of how much time had passed, or how much additional harm had accumulated in between. I asked him directly whether he understood the difference between an old debt he'd meant to repay and a forged signature on a new account, opened years into my active, documented absence from their lives. He didn't have an answer for that question either. I don't think, honestly, he ever fully will. With the forged signature confirmed and the pattern of fraud fully documented across 4 accounts, Delphine formalized the identity theft disputes with all relevant creditors and credit bureaus, moving to have the fraudulent debts discharged and my credit history corrected. She also referred the case at my direction for a formal fraud investigation, understanding my choice not to pursue the harshest possible criminal outcome against my own parents, while still insisting the fraud itself be documented plainly and permanently, on the record, exactly as it had actually happened. Priya's wedding arrived 3 weeks later, and I went, prepared in a way I hadn't been prepared for anything in years. I didn't make a scene. I simply found my Aunt Denise during the cocktail hour, and a few of the other relatives who'd apparently believed the disappearance story most fully, and told them plainly and calmly the actual truth. Been reachable my entire life, working, living, building something steady, and that the story they'd been told for 4 years had been constructed, deliberately, to cover something considerably less sympathetic than a missing daughter. Denise's face, hearing it laid out plainly, went through something complicated, shock, then a kind of retroactive anger on my behalf, then finally a quiet, careful apology for every year she'd spent worried about the wrong thing entirely. I always wondered why your mother got so vague whenever I asked for specific, she admitted. I told myself I was just imagining things. I should have trusted that instinct a long time ago. I told her she couldn't have known what she wasn't given the tools to see, and that I wasn't there to assign blame to relatives who'd simply believed what they were told by people they had every reason to trust. 2 other cousins joined that conversation partway through, drawn over by the particular gravity of Denise's expression, and I found myself repeating the same plain, factual account 3 more times that evening, each time a little steadier than the last. By the end of the reception, standing near the dessert table with Owen's hand resting lightly on my back, I felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for months, maybe longer. I hadn't fixed everything that night. I had, for the first time in 4 years, let the actual boring, entirely undramatic truth about my life exist plainly in front of the people who'd spent that same 4 years believing something considerably worse. I didn't pursue criminal fraud charges against my parents in the end, though Delphine confirmed the evidence would very likely have supported it. What I wanted most, once the debts were cleared and the true story finally sat correctly with the people who mattered most to me, wasn't to watch my parents face prosecution. It was simply for 4 years of my actual, ordinary, entirely undisappeared life to exist plainly, on the record, in a family that could no longer quietly rewrite it into something else for their own convenience. Rebuilding anything real with Caleb and Marisol after all of this has been slower and more careful than I expected, mostly because both of them are still working through their own complicated grief about how much they unknowingly believed and helped sustain over those 4 years. Caleb and I talk regularly now, honestly, in a way we genuinely never managed before any of this happened. My relationship with my parents remains exactly what it was before the lawsuit: quiet, distant, unlikely to meaningfully change, though at least now built on a foundation of documented truth rather than a fiction I never knew I was starring in. Marisol, the youngest of the 3 of us, took the longest to fully process everything, understandably given how much of her own adult identity had apparently been shaped around a version of me she genuinely believed had vanished. We had a long, difficult conversation on the phone a few weeks after the wedding, most of it her working through years of quiet, complicated grief she'd never had anywhere to put. Grief for a sister she thought was missing, layered confusingly with the discovery that the sister had in fact been entirely fine the whole time, which somehow didn't make the years of genuine worry feel any less real in hindsight. I told her I understood completely that grieving something that turns out to have been unnecessary doesn't erase how genuinely it was felt at the time. She cried for a while on that call. I think we both did, eventually. I think often about that first text from my Aunt Denise. "We've all been so worried. I'm just relieved you're safe." I understand now that relief wasn't really about me at all, not the actual me, working an ordinary job, living an ordinary life 2 hours away. It was relief about a story, one my parents had built carefully enough that even people who loved me completely couldn't tell the difference between genuine crisis and convenient fiction, not until someone finally handed them the actual paperwork. It's been about 4 months since Priya's wedding. My credit is fully restored, every fraudulent account formally discharged, my name finally, legally, entirely my own again. I sent Denise a photo last month from a weekend trip Owen and I took. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary picture of an ordinary happy life, captioned simply, "Still here, still exactly where I've always been." She replied within minutes with 3 heart emojis and a promise to actually call more often instead of just texting. It's a small thing. After 4 years of being quietly, deliberately erased from my own family's understanding of reality, small, ordinary things like that have started to feel like more than enough. That's my story. One forged signature, one fabricated disappearance, and a family that finally has to reckon with exactly where I was the whole time. If this reminded you that silence gets written into whatever story serves the person telling it, take that as your sign today. Share it with someone who's ever had their absence explained away by someone else's convenient version of events. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.